Hello, and welcome to the fourth pre record for the Britain a Racial Nation module, where I'll be outlining what we're doing for the next 2 weeks. So, after we looked at the Crusades in the last lecture, we're coming back to Britain. What I wanted to do was give a big kind of continental or intercontinental context to everything that was happening. This week, we're going back to focus mainly on England. There will be elements of race for the next fortnight, but we'll mainly be looking at kind of national identity and nationalism through two different periods, the High Middle Ages and the Late Middle Ages. So, because the medieval period is about 1,000 years in total, it's often divided up into three main periods. One which we've already covered, the second of which is called the High Middle Ages, and that's from the Norman invasion of England for about 200 years, just less than 200 years to 1217. And that's what we'll be doing next week. And the week after, we'll be looking at the Late Middle Ages, which is from 1217 to 1453. Because over this time period, the area of land that is controlled by the Norman Angles expands quite a lot. So you can see on this slide that it's it's not a traditional empire in the sense of that it's a continuous landmass, but there are three or four areas that are controlled by the same monarch. So you have a united England, you have parts of southern Italy, obviously Normandy here in northern France, and then at the bottom here you have parts of the Middle East, which we discussed last week. So England is becoming more influential. The kings of England are controlling more geographic area, and as a result of this, you start to get kind of nationalist tendencies and the idea of expansion, and people from England feeling again like part of an empire. But unlike when it was part of the Roman Empire, England is in many ways the driving force along with the area of northern France. So, for the next 2 weeks, we'll be looking at what events happen in that time period and how that affects the idea of what it is to be English. And we'll be looking at three or four areas for each time period. Next week, we'll be looking at the earlier time period. And there are a few things that happen that really shape English history. The first of which is essentially a civil war, which is called the Anarchy. And the period, the 100 years, 200 years after William the Conqueror dies, which is basically where we left it last time, you have a politically divided England. And this even though England has this additional territory in other parts of the world, England itself is politically unstable. After William the Conqueror dies, his sons go into a series of kind of power struggles over who is going to lead England forward, because after a couple of generations, the direct male line from William ends. And what happens is his descendant Henry, who is dying, says that yes, his son died in an event called the White Ship Disaster, which I'll be talking about in more detail in the lecture. He says, yes, my son has died in this unfortunate accident, but I want my daughter to be made monarch. Now, this is a radical idea at the time, and many in England object to it because of the patriarchal nature of England. And we've talked a lot about how race is changing and ideas of race, and white Christian values being the foundation of England. But it's also important to note that it is very patriarchal, like all societies at this time. Eventually, when Matilda reaches the throne, her cousin Stephen objects, and many of the barons of England back him because he's a male. Eventually, the anarchy is very destructive. Hundreds of thousands die in it, and eventually Matilda's son actually becomes the king. So the direct male line to William is reintroduced, but it's the idea of what we talked about over the last few weeks of a power struggle. And after William dies, there's no one as unifying as him for a long time. The idea that these people have more care more about France than England never goes away, and a xenophobic attitude towards the French only continues to grow throughout this period because people in England feel as though they're oppressed in their own country. And what we'll do in next week's session is look at some of the kings that happen after William and what they do, some of whom I've already touched upon already. So what you have is England is changing generally. Women's roles become more defined, and I'll talk about that in more detail. Also, towns. New towns are planned, so the landscape of England continues to evolve. And what happens under all of the leaders really is an aggressive expansion. So not just in the Middle East, but into the Celtic regions of Britain. So above me here on this slide, Henry I continues to expand into Wales, into Ireland, and into Scotland on the idea against those Celtic nations and some of the pagan beliefs, expanding the Christian ideology. There will be events that you will have heard of a long time ago, but probably not studied for a while. Henry murdering Thomas à Becket, Archbishop of Canterbury, which is a really important event in English history, and mainly because it causes a rift between England and the rest of the European church. So when we talked about the Crusades last week, England doesn't have an easy alliance with the other European countries because it is seen as not defending the Christian church as well as kind of areas in Central and Southern Europe do. So its relationship with religion changes, and that changes the national identity, which is very separate from continental Europe, and that continues to be the case until now. So we spoke a lot about Richard I, Richard the Lionheart in the Crusades lecture, and when he takes the throne, are a bunch of massacres of Jewish communities in England. So we see race and attitudes to other races continuing to get worse. So we talked about the formation of the idea of race, and this is where racialized attitudes continue to get worse. And another important thing that we'll be talking about next week is the King John, who was a weak leader, lost a war with France, and this led to another important thing you probably heard of, but might not know the connotations of it, the Magna Carta and the First Barons' War in 1215 to 1217, respectively. So I'll be talking about the Magna Carta. So please come to the lecture with some ideas about what it is. The basic principle of it is the barons of the country, the kind of wealthy landed elite of the country, don't like the taxation that John is putting on them. The wars that he led in France were unsuccessful, and he is in an incredibly weak position, and the barons force him to concede some powers as a result of this. And this is really the continuation of a strict social hierarchy forming in England, and this rich elite who have a great deal of power moving forward. So the king, throughout the medieval period, actually loses power. And that is obviously a problem for the rulers of England throughout this period. So that's what we'll be looking at next week: the political instability, the xenophobic attitudes, ideas of race, and the beginning of wars against France, which continue into the late Middle Ages, which is what we'll be doing in 2 weeks' time. The late Middle Ages are just a disaster for England and the rest of Europe as a whole. Any kind of progress that has been made really falls apart, and it's part of a wider crisis, as it's known. It's literally called the crisis of the late Middle Ages. What you have happening is there's been a warm period which meant that Europe had good crops, regular healthy crops. But in the late Middle Ages, the temperature begins to decrease. There are prolonged periods of rainfall. There's the winters are incredibly harsh, and you have something called the Great Famine, which hits England and the rest of continental Europe. And we'll look at kind of what effect that has on England as a nation and the idea of a nation state. What happens when the crops begin to fail and the cattle begin to die and people cannot afford to buy food? Mass flooding throughout areas such as Yorkshire and Nottingham. And then this is followed a few decades later with the Black Death, which is the most deadly pandemic recorded in human history, where between a third, although it's difficult to tell with these kind of estimates, between a third and half of Europe's population died. So, what impact do these awful events have on England and the idea of England as a nation, and indeed racialized attitudes, which we'll be talking about, because the Black Death has some connotations there. A second really important point we'll be talking about in 2 weeks is the 100 Years' War. This is really where the recognizable nations we see today are beginning to form. So England is basically at war pretty much constantly for over a century. The crisis that I was just talking about, the lack of resources, and the plague lead to nations being at odds with each other. And England and France have had these tensions for a long time, especially because the Normans are from that area. And what happens is the kings of England play on these patriotic ideas of defending your nation, and this becomes deeply entrenched in the psyche of the English nation. And whilst initially successful, England basically ends up losing, and England and France and the Normans split over time, and that foreign influence starts to disintegrate. Although, in many ways, so much had assimilated anyway. But national identities and loyalties become incredibly popular. And when there are nationalistic sentiments, you get racialized ideas. So we'll be talking about those. And we'll be finishing the second week by looking at something called the Peasants' Revolt. I'm not sure if Charlotte maybe did this in your first year with you. But the combination of the Great Famine, the Black Plague, and the 100 Years' War takes a heavy toll on the English population. Anger towards the establishment and the barons kind of all culminates in the Peasants' Revolt of 1381, where tax collectors are coming round England and the peasants essentially organise themselves to try and break the social structure of England. And they do a lot of damage. They invade London, several high ranking officials are killed. And really, this is the culmination of centuries of unhappiness with French influence, with social structure that was introduced. But it also goes to show, because it ultimately fails, how difficult it is to break the foundations that the Normans have led. So, the two things I want you to do before you come to the seminars for next week's session on the High Middle Ages, I want you to listen to History Extra podcast, The Clifford's Tower Massacre, and Medieval Anti-Semitism. I know several of you are interested in this. So it's about 40 minutes. Make sure you listen to it, because I will be asking you about it in the seminar. And then in 2 weeks' time, when we're going through the late Middle Ages, read Susan Wade's opinion piece, Uprisings After Pandemics Have Happened Before. just look at the English Peasant Revolt of 1381. And with that one in particular, as it's an opinion piece, I want you to discuss in the session, do you agree with it? Do you not agree with it? Both those links will be on Moodle. So make sure you're prepared for the seminars. And really, for the next 2 weeks, there will be some talk about race, but it will mainly be about nationalism and the national identity, because so much of English heritage is Bell, and the idea of Englishness forms in these two periods. So thanks a lot, and I will see you on Monday.